know me, my name is Sonia, and today I wanted to talk about a book that I finished reading called In the Land of Jim Crow. It's by Ray Sprigle, and this is kind of along the same theme as the other two books that I was talking about in one of my other videos. I stumbled upon it after reading Blacklikeme and Soul Sister, and in that other video I talked about those two books and how I thought they were good pairings because they were along the same theme. Well, this third book would be perfect to pair with those two books as well. So, how I stumbled upon this book was just kind of serendipity, I guess. I was Googling some more books by the person that wrote Blacklikeme, who is John Howard Griffin, and I came upon a Wikipedia page, and under his list of books was a See Also section, and there was a list of names of other people who had done similar experiments, gone undercover as a Black person. And in those names was Ray Sprigle, who had done this in 1948, and then John Howard Griffin, who wrote Blacklikeme, he had gone undercover in the South in by the time he published his book, it was 1961, and then Soul Sister, she went undercover as a Black woman, and she went to Harlem, New York, and her book was written in 1969, I believe, 1969. So I had heard of Blacklikeme. I knew it was a classic and all of that, but I had never heard of In the Land of Jim Crow. So when I saw that it was written in 1949, which was 12 years before Blacklikeme, I was kind of like, wow, I got to read that. So my next mission was to locate the book. I was looking on Amazon, looking at public libraries. First of all, on Amazon, the book was selling for $350. It's an out-of-print book, apparently, and none of my local libraries had it. There were two local colleges that had it, but one of them was only lending books out to current students, and the other library was 2 hours away. So that wasn't possible. So the saving grace was this online database of books. It's the website was Internet Archive, and I was able to read the book online. It kind of had an inconvenient process of checking out the book every hour for as long as it takes to read the book. It didn't take that long to read. It probably took me 2 or 3 days because, I was taking notes and I wasn't reading all day. So that was just like a leisurely read and taking notes. It was only about 200 pages. So it wasn't that big of a deal, and I was very thankful that Internet Archive was making it available to me, an out-of-print book that I wouldn't be able to access anywhere else. So my experience reading that book, I was really surprised because the writing seemed pretty timeless. It seemed like it could have been written today. I found the author, Ray Sprigle, I thought he was funny. I mean, sometimes when his humor came through, even though he was writing about a tough subject. Like, for instance, he was talking about when he first decided to go undercover as a Black person into the South. he wanted to know like how he could color his skin and for his disguise. So he thought maybe walnut oil or something. He could put that over his skin. Well, he ordered a bunch of it, and he said it did not stick well because as soon as he started sweating or anything, took a shower, whatever, it would just be streaky. So that wasn't an option, but he said he was stuck with a lot of that product that he doesn't know what to do with now. So I found it really interesting that he didn't end up really going under disguise like John Howard Griffin and Grace Halsell did. They had started taking a pill for vitiligo and darkening their skin to go undercover. But Ray Sprigle, he just tanned and cut his hair really short, and he talked about how there was a lot of people that looked really light that were black, considered black, and but looked white. And he talked more about passing and things like that. And an example that he used was Walter White, which is from the NAACP at that time. And if you look him up, he looks white. And so I found that really interesting because my first reaction when I looked at John Howard Griffin in Blacklikeme and when I looked at pictures, I thought it was strange because his features were very kind of like Anglo, and he only had dark skin from the vitiligo pills. And so to me, it looked like a white person with dark skin. And so that just goes to show that you never really know, you can't really judge people on their appearance, you don't really know what their heritage is. But I thought it was also funny that he said he was only challenged twice. His blackness was challenged twice, and it was both by black people. He said that he was talking with a doctor, a black doctor, and he had a companion, a black companion, who was taking him around and introducing him as his cousin. That was his way into the black world, into the black South. Otherwise, people would be suspicious of this person. So he said that he was talking with this black doctor, and after a minor exchange, the doctor looked at the companion and says, "Why are you carrying around this white guy with you?" And so he knew right off the bat. And so the companion, his response was, "Well, he says he's black, and that's enough for me. Unless you have a way of determining otherwise, then his word's good enough for me," which is interesting because then that kind of like makes you think of like Rachel Dolezal and things like that. But back to the book. So Ray Sprigle was a journalist. He was a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, and he won the award for exposing a Supreme Court judge as having ties with the Klan. So he says his motive for going undercover as a black person in the South and writing about it, his experience, was, he says it wasn't anything really honorable or heroic. It was just, he thought it would make an interesting story. But, towards the end, he was kind of writing about his takeaways and his observations all the way through the book. It was kind of like he was talking with various people and hearing about he was hearing their stories. Basically, it seemed like he kind of was like an NAACP field agent, or he was traveling with an NAACP field agent, and they were going around interviewing people and hearing stories and things like that. So the things that he talked about in his book were like sharecroppers, black sharecroppers, which John Spriggle said that whole sharecropping business in the South was like grand larceny, because black sharecroppers were always ripped off. They weren't paid what they were due. And he talked more about the railroad, the Pullman porters. There was no mention of Pullman porters in Blacklikeme, and maybe that was because he was traveling from Texas to Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi. He took the bus. He talked about taking the bus, where Ray Sprigle took the train, and I believe he also took the bus, which I think, contrasting the differences of all of these books, I found really interesting as well. For instance, Ray Sprigle talked about he learned how Black people traveled to the South. Because he was going to rural areas, so he said it was kind of like Black people stay with Black people who open their homes up for travelers, because there wasn't a lot of hotels that were catering to Black people in rural areas. And if there were, they were just really probably shady and run down and things like that. Which I also found was interesting, because Grace Halsell in Soul Sister, she didn't travel to the South. She just went to Harlem, New York, but she stayed in hotels, and she did say that the ones that catered to Black people were her experience. She stayed at cheaper hotels, and there was just a lot of shadiness going on. Like, she didn't feel safe. I feel like with Grace Halsell, she just was afraid the whole time that she was undercover as a Black person, which I think is another interesting thing, because Ray Sprigle in the Land of Jim Crow, he was the only one of the three that traveled around as a Black person with a companion, and the other people didn't. They relied on people that they briefly met, and so I feel like that might have impacted their takeaways and their observations and even their experience a lot more, because it felt like with Grace Halsell, she was just kind of like roaming the streets, and her experience was just kind of like happenstance. It wasn't really planned out. She didn't really have a guide really helping her navigate. But it's interesting because Ray Sprigle also said that his time being undercover as a Black man, that he was afraid the whole time as well. But that was mainly because people briefed him on like how to act in the Jim Crow South, and it was like you always have to say yes sir to white people. You always have to do this, always do that, and so he became terrified that if he didn't do it, or if he forgot, or what would the consequences be. Like, I mean, he knew that the consequences were dire. Also, I think that it was really interesting that all of the three books were almost written in sequential decades. Like I said, Ray Sprigle wrote In the Land of Jim Crow in the late 1940s, and so there was more talk of passing, voting, sharecropping. He talks more about how people are not that far removed from slavery at that time. He talked about his guide, who was only 18 years removed from slavery. So his guide was also somebody prominent in Atlanta. His name was John Wesley Dobbs, and he was known as the unofficial mayor of Atlanta. His grandson became the mayor of Atlanta, the real mayor, and his name was Maynard Jackson. And when Maynard Jackson became mayor of Atlanta, he named a street after his grandpa. Um, John Wesley Dobbs also has a school named after him and a plaza named after him. He was active in voter registration. He had worked for the Postal Service, and he was active in a lot of other things. And Ray Sprigle was able to meet John Wesley Dobbs through Walter White. Like I said, was with the NAACP. He paired them up, and so that he could have a traveling companion, which Grace Spriggle says he owes a lot to for the outcome of this project, just because of the observations that he took away, everything that he learned. So some other topics that were discussed in the book were, like hospital admittance, like emergency care. They talked about how, because of Jim Crow, there were separate hospitals for white people and black people. There were some hospitals that might cater to both, but if they catered to black people, they only had one ward, and it was usually in the basement or something like that, with no ventilation, and maybe in the laundry room or something. It's just terrible. He talked about people who said, like, if there was a car accident, people had to bypass the white hospital to maybe drive an hour away to get to one that would take black people. And a lot of people died along the way. There was one instance where a lady was going into labor. She needed an emergency C-section, and she was going to deliver at home with a doula or something, midwife. And they ran her to the hospital like an hour away. And I just can't imagine being in labor, needing an emergency C-section, and having to like be in the car for like another hour, and she died along the way. It's just terrible. Another topic that he talked a lot about was the education of black children and the disparities in the school system and the school buildings, the lack of books, the lack of teachers, and underpaying teachers, how black kids in rural areas would have to walk 6 miles to school, 6 miles back, and while they're being passed by white kids on a school bus. The school buses weren't available to black kids. He talks about voter disenfranchisement, how people were intimidated to vote because they could be murdered. One person in Atlanta, he was going to cast the first black vote. Well, he did cast the first black vote in Atlanta, in a county in Atlanta. His name was Maceo Snipes. He was a veteran. He was honorably discharged, and he was allowed to vote. But then afterwards, maybe a week later, he was murdered. And so it's just really disgusting. Like after, legally, it may look like black people had the right to vote, but they were still hindered in different ways, whether it was poll taxes, threats, manipulation, just straight up lies, like you're not on the voter registration list, purging of registration lists. And Ray Sprigle also talked about how this impacted jury selection, because the jury selection would use the names of registered voters on the registration list. Well, they would just purge those lists and say there were no qualified black jurors to select. So there's a lot of manipulation going on. Some other topics were taxation without representation, which he was saying meant more than having black representatives, having black legislators, things like that. It meant they were paying the taxes, but they weren't reaping any rewards from the taxes. They were paying to maintain public beaches, but they weren't allowed on the public beach. Things like that. Parks, same thing with parks. Schools. I think Ray Sprigle said something like, black people were held to the expense of being a citizen, but they were unable to reap those rewards. So isn't that funny? It's when it's time to pay, you're recognized as being a citizen, like this is your obligation. But then when it's time to use those public resources, they're not available to you. Black people weren't allowed into the swimming pool. Like he talked about people being arrested for even like being on a public beach, and just like the manipulative ways that how things would work. Like it may not always be so black and white. Like he would talk about when they were traveling to the South, the rural South, and they had to stop at a gas station. If it was a white gas station, because they had to use a bathroom for whatever reason. How people might not flat out say, well, this is for whites only, but they would just say, well, it's out of order, it's under maintenance. And gas station after gas station would say that same excuse. So I thought this was an amazing book. I mean, I think I liked Blacklikeme, I really did. But that read kind of more like a novel, although it was a true account. But this was more like like I said, being a NAACP field agent or something, and or tagging along with one and interviewing the people and hearing what they have to say. And I felt like it was more dynamic and also diverse than the other two books. I felt like the people that he interacted with were professionals, and then he met with like sharecroppers, landowners, business owners, activists. So he met with a wide array of people, whereas the other two, I don't I feel like Grace Halsell interacted mostly with domestic workers, and that John Howard Griffin met mostly with working class people. For instance, the first person that he met when he went undercover in Louisiana as a black person was a black shoe shine person. Well, I don't know what that's called, but he owned the stand. In the Land of Jim Crow, there was tons of names of landmarks, court cases like murders, personal accounts, and that is exactly why I love reading nonfiction, because of like these little leads. So I would Google all of those places, and like for instance, Camp Sumter, when they were driving past Camp Sumter, which is also known as Andersonville Prison. It used to be known as Andersonville Prison, and now it's a national park, and the grave sites of Union soldiers. And so John Wesley Dobbs said that him, as well as a lot of other of the black people there, would, every time they passed by, they would stop by that area and give thanks or honor their respects to those Union soldiers that died in service. Well, especially because it was in the Civil War and it was on behalf of freedom for black people. So Andersonville Prison is where Union soldiers were imprisoned, and 14,000 of them died while they were there. Then there was like high profile cases like Henry Gilbert, a murder of a landowner and farmer. He was a preacher, and he was falsely accused of a crime. There was a personal account of Dr. Hugh Morris Gloucester, and so this came up when Ray Sprigle was talking about how it doesn't matter how educated or how many degrees you have, or anything like that. It doesn't matter if you're a professional. Violence doesn't discriminate. And he used Dr. Hugh Morris Gloucester as an example for that. And then when I looked up this person, he was the president of Morehouse, I think, Morehouse College, and he was an author of a book, and so he was a very prominent person himself. Another murder was the Maceo Snipes, the veteran who cast that first vote in that Atlanta county. Some other landmarks were Mounds Bayou, which was an all-black town. It had its own mayor, it had all-black businesses, all-black school. You know, it was just a fully functioning all-black town. And that was in the Mississippi Delta. And then Flint River Farms Resettlement Project, apparently in 1937, the government bought up some land and parceled it out to black sharecroppers or farmers, to any of those who could afford a down payment, and then they would have 40 years to pay off that loan to own that land. But I saw a follow-up article on how many people still own that land, because that's a whole nother thing. How many people have been coerced out of their property. And I came across the Monroe Massacre, which was about a mob of white men murdered 4 Black people. And so there is, and this was in Atlanta, so I guess there's still like a reenactment every year of this, and it's kind of like to raise awareness and to for people never to forget this. It was in the book. Ray Sprigle said that everybody knows the names of the murderers, but nobody had been arrested. And so apparently the FBI had closed the case, but nobody had been arrested for that. And so that's kind of why these activists hold this reenactment every year. So just as John Howard Griffin in Blacklikeme had gone undercover, I think for 7 weeks or something, this person, Ray Sprigle, he went undercover for 30 days. What he did was he wrote articles, a series of articles about his experience, and it was published in his newspaper. But those articles were the precursor to his book. So Ray Sprigle, the areas that he focused on were mostly Atlanta, heavily on Atlanta, Georgia, heavily on Georgia. And he talked about the different counties where things happened. So I guess county by county is different. He focused on Georgia and also Mississippi, but he also mentioned Florida and Alabama. Whereas John Howard Griffin focused heavily on Louisiana, and then Alabama and Mississippi. Grace also focused on Harlem, New York, but this was beyond the era of Jim Crow, and she was the only one not to go into the South. So I found this book so interesting. Like I said, I liked Blacklikeme. I liked In the Land of Jim Crow. I did not like Soul Sister. However, in the context of the 3 books, I still think it's a good read just because it's part of the theme. It's, the only woman of the 3, and because of the time sequence, the era, I think it's good to compare the little things like she didn't have a companion go with her. The conditions of the hotels that she was staying at, and it kind of gives you more context when Ray Sprigle talks about hotels that are run down, and that a lot of Black people don't even stay there. They travel by staying with people in their homes. And so maybe if Grace Halsell had more of an in with someone, maybe she would have had a different experience. But I mean, all of those are, whether they're mistakes or not, it makes it good for analyzing, I think. Yeah, so I just wanted to update you all on that I wanted to add this book, In the Land of Jim Crow, to that series of other books. And I'm not always going to focus on books like this. My goal going forward is to read more books on my bookshelf. Some of the books are so old that I don't remember what they're about, especially the details. And also, there's some books that I haven't even read yet, because I used to be one of those people that was obsessed with buying books, but then I just never found the time to actually read them the way that I wanted to. So that's my goal going forward, is read the books. Instead of buying more books, I want to read what's on my shelf. And I have actually read one book from my bookshelf so far after I made that decision. And that was called Not Buying It. And I will probably do another video on that. So thank you for joining me. I hope that you read this book. Very interesting. And I think you'll really enjoy it. It'll be insightful. Like whether you know a lot about Jim Crow already or Black history already or whatever, there's still details in there that historical details that anybody could learn from. And it's like clues in these nonfiction books. I think they are. Well, thank you for joining, and I hope you do read it. Hope you read all 3 of them. Bye.